So thank you for joining us today for the history of Spokane. The presentation you are about to enjoy is a part of Whatcom READS, which is brought to you by all the academic and public libraries in Bellingham and Whatcom County and our community partner Village Books. Whatcom READS has been working together for 15 years. This is our 15-year anniversary. And these organizations are achieving the vision of hosting an annual literary happening that has neighbors talking with neighbors about great literature and the joy of reading together. Whatcom READS thrives thanks to significant funding from Friends of the Bellingham Public Library and the Whatcom County Library Foundation, as well as support from other businesses and organizations. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, Wendy McLeod. Wendy, in addition to having a strong interest in history and historical research, is a native Spokaneite, born and raised there. Wendy is also the assistant branch manager at the Lynden Library. So please enjoy Wendy's program. Thanks.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm really excited to put on this program. I was asked to do it like Anne mentioned. I grew up in Spokane, was actually born at Fairchild Air Force Base and grew up until my very early 20s. And me and my husband got married and we moved west, further west, across the state. But my whole kind of growing up experience was from living in Spokane. And a lot of the stories and things that you're going to hear about today are kind of came out of my curiosity of things that I heard about growing up, that this program allowed me the opportunity to kind of dive a little deeper and learn more about those people and those subjects. And I've kind of related them to how they could fit in with our Whatcom READS with the Cold Millions and kind of give it some backstory, and then how those kind of ideologies continue to thrive in Spokane. And so I'm going to start our program with doing our land acknowledgement, and allowing me to do the land acknowledgement because I made a slight modification to it to give some appreciation to the tribal members that are going to be spoken about in the Spokane area. So we are occupying the ancestral lands of the Nooksack and Lemhi people. We will be discussing in our program the traditional and sacred lands of the Spokane tribe of Indians, including the upper band, the middle band, the lower band, and the Chewalish band. They have been stewards since time immemorial, respecting the land, the river, the ocean, and understanding that everything is connected, related, and alive. We acknowledge that the elders and their collective and individual plights and achievements. We consider these legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together today. And we pursue ongoing action to build lasting relationships and grow together so that we may all prosper. And on that land acknowledgement note, I'm going to jump into the program to talk about Chief Gary. Chief Gary and his Native American name was Slokicha. He was a prominent member of his tribe. He came from the Middle Spokane's tribe. His father, Liam Spokane, was the chief of his tribe within all the different Spokane tribes. And the Hudson Bay Company, when they came and started exploring the area to see what resources and kind of survey the area were available, they made connection with the local tribes, including the Spokane tribes, and requested of them to help establish some relationship and connection, requested for them to consider sending a male child to the Red River Settlement Missionary School so they might be educated and converted into Christianity, with the purpose of that being that they could come back to their tribes and serve as translators, could serve as representatives, and kind of speak for their tribes and be able to make connection with the incoming new military and government that was coming into the area. But what surprised them is the Indian chiefs did one better than that. They just didn't get some random young male child from their tribes. They sent their own personal male sons to the Red River settlement with the thought that if they sent their own prestigious children to the settlement, that they would be treated with a little more dignity and respect than some other random kid from their tribe, and that they would already have kind of, with their lineage, have some prestige within the tribe itself. So when they act as representative with the knowledge that they're going to gain from going to this missionary school, that would kind of better put them in a position of representation. So that was kind of the mindset at the time. So Slokicha went to Red River Settlement to be converted into Christianity. And when he was baptized with a new name, Spokane Gary. Gary, the name Gary came from, that was a name that was taken from one of the executives from the Hudson Bay Company. So he was named after an executive from that company. And that was his kind of new name that he pretty much lived with the whole rest of his life when he became baptized and became learned. So he went to Red River. He learned how to write and speak English and French. He picked up on his education extremely well. He also learned math. He learned a lot about agricultural processes. And matter of fact, he learned so well that there's a famous quote that he made to botanist David Douglas, that at a certain point during his education, he really started to feel like he was kind of losing some of his own language and cultural understanding. And he felt like he was starting to kind of get lost in that way. And after a certain point, his father had started becoming ill, and he had opportunity to return back home to his home tribe, and he did regain his language pretty quickly and was able to have that culture back again to where he could serve in the way that was thought to be intended, as being a representative with that background knowledge into essentially white man ways. But when he came back, once he completed his education and he came back to his tribe, one of the first things that Chief Gary did was establish a school. And for doing that back in the very early mid 1800s, he's often credited as being the first school teacher for the Spokane area, because it truly was the first schoolhouse that was ever developed. And he taught the local tribes children everything that he learned about English and French and agricultural practices and whatnot. And they did benefit a certain amount with having that information. The Spokaneite tribes in that area were starting to grow in number. They were up to 600 members of the tribe, and were described as being quite happy and prosperous, doing quite well with their farming practices that they were starting to integrate into their own culture and whatnot. But more and more white settlers were also encroaching and coming into that area by that period. And many lines were crossed, particularly with the miners, who had a specific goal to use the land in a way that they weren't as keen to. But there was a lot of other kind of commerce related things that were very specifically wanted by settlers coming into the area with lumber and fur trade and everything else. Governor Stevens, relatively early in that period, recognized that they were having some pretty serious tension issues. They were already starting to have some battles and some squabbles amongst settlers and the Indian nations in the area, and thought he would ramify the whole issue by just suggesting that the Indians would just relocate to another reservation that has already been established for the Nez Perce and the Yakima Indians someplace else. And Gary went on their behalf to try to explain to Governor Stevens that that's a very misguided argument to try to make, or offer that he was trying to suggest, because what was most important to the peoples of those tribes is that they retained their homeland, that their sacred land was supremely important to them. And the whole issue that all Native Americans are all relative, that we all don't necessarily get along. So just suggesting that we should go pick up and go move in with another tribe is a little misguided as a plan, and was supremely unpopular. So Stevens came to kind of understand that from Gary, but by that point, his suggestion for them just to kind of do that really deteriorated any amount of negotiation that Gary could have tried to do to stem off a lot of the war situations that were already brewing between Indian warriors and soldiers, because it was very clear that to the Indian warriors that the new government is really just wanting their land, and that was the one thing they weren't willing to sacrifice, and were willing to sacrifice of their lives to retain. More and more military members were starting to take up camp along the Snake River, and tensions were growing higher and higher all the time. Gary, during this whole period, really, because of his, I think part of his education as a young person to try to be that spokesperson and to be that bridge, tried to remain neutral, but that kind of compromised his own credibility with his own Native American families and tribal members, because they looked at it as he should just be fighting to the death along with the rest of them for this land. And I think he was trying his whole life to strike some sort of balance between, it was important to him, yes, to try to get them any land that they could to negotiate from the government using these methods for which he was taught by them. But he also wanted to save lives. He didn't want to see any more of his family members or his tribal members sacrificed for that. So it was a tough decision and a tough battle, I think, internally for him as well. So the fighting continued and got intensely more brutal, particularly with Colonel Wright taking the lead as the in-charge military member of the area. And eventually this all comes to a head with Gary in the Latah Creek incident, where many Indian warriors lost their lives. They were hung along Latah Creek. Their horses were all destroyed. Their food stocks were burned, their homelands were burned, and anybody left behind was just kind of left to starve. And it was a particularly brutal and horrible battle that I can't really shook Gary, and it shook a lot of the chiefs that were there, because even though many of the warriors and those were very prepared to die to hold on to their lands, there was a real balance to, do we save our people or do we save our land? And so Chief Gary and Spokane Chief Big Star did end up signing the treaty to surrender in September 23rd of 1958 on Latah Creek. And you see here kind of a memorial stone that was put in that place to commemorate that sacrifice that was made. But Gary still wanted to achieve the goal of preserving land for the Indian nations in the Spokane area. And so he continued with his fight in what he felt was a relatively peaceful and an appropriate manner, as he had been taught, by writing letters and meeting with military and government members, explaining to them that it was their desire to retain as much of their space and of their sacred lands for those specific tribes on their land and on their terms as possible, that they had to meet some kind of sacrifice. And this is in the mid and later 1800s. So Spokane as a city hasn't, I mean, it's just burgeoning. There's just settlement camps. There's no like real town here yet. So in their mind, it's not a huge ask, because they look at it, it's just their sacred lands that's important to them. Whereas the government and the military, they, having been surveyed and looked at, knew the value of what they wanted to get from it. So that was really, nobody was willing to compromise. It was a winner take all kind of scenario. And so most military and government members did not take Gary seriously at all. They would easily blow him off, not pay him any regard. They would quote him wrongly and describe of him wrongly, whereas a lot of people who were locals to the Spokane area knew Chief Gary personally, respected him very highly, and knew that he was somebody who was really attempting to make these negotiations in a respectful and a peaceful manner as could be achieved, because he really didn't want any more of his people to be killed, even though they were being killed every time he turned around with different squabbles that were popping up all around him. Finally, by 1981, the government did establish one small Spokane Indian reservation. It was kind of on the where the river, Spokane River meets the Columbia River, kind of on the west side. But that land really only represented property, essentially, that was important to the lower band of the Spokanese. It didn't address any of the lands that were dear to the middle and the upper and the other tribes of the Spokane area. And they still wanted their shares of their sacred lands as well. So he went back and submitted his last big pitch effort for them to consider reservation lands on both sides of the Spokane River, starting from the city of Spokane to Tum Tum, which is about 20 miles downriver, and make that some reservation space to represent reservation land for those other tribes as well. And it was completely turned down. They wouldn't even consider it. Matter of fact, they were so tired and frustrated of listening to Gary for all these years that the government decided that they were going to finally just tell the upper and the middle bands to relinquish all their lands. They're fed up listening to them, and they're going to move them to Coeur d'Alene Reservation in Idaho. That's just where you're going to go. So that was the final decision. That was the hammer on the ground, and that's all they were going to do. And again, to kind of save people over land, Gary did sign that peace treaty. And I feel again that when push came to shove, Gary tended to side on saving his people. He didn't want any more of his people to die, even though it was their desire to save their land. And he was at the age of 76 at this time, so he's getting much older as well. So with this, here is a picture of Chief Gary in his later years. And in his remaining years, after all was just kind of said and done, and he didn't have anything really left to fight over, it was intention for him to live out the rest of his life in a farm that he had deeded and was his possession, papered and everything, in what's now modern day Hilliard area of Spokane. But unfortunately, while he was away on a fishing trip in 1988, some white settlers came into his farm and took it over. And when he returned with his family to come home, they ordered him off of his own property and told him that they were taking over and he could leave and that he could go off to the reservation with the rest of them. And he attempted to fight that in court, knowing that he lawfully owned that land and he had documentation to support that he owned that land. But the court just decided to ignore all that or lose his paperwork or whatever. So it was to no avail. They kicked him off of his own land. So he and his family relocated into teepees off of Latah Creek, kind of in an area, if you're in Spokane, it'd be right underneath where the Sunset Highway Bridge is now. They settled in that area for a period, but they were heavily harassed there by some local settlers and other people that didn't appreciate them being there. So he just kind of pushed himself further and further west along Latah Creek in the west of Spokane. And there he did finally pass away at the age of, I think it was 81. And he was penniless at that point. He died in a pauper's grave and was placed in Greenwood Memorial Terrace with just a small wooden cross. And that was all that was left of his legacy at that time. Now, by 1925, people wanted to really acknowledge all the work that he had tried to do in a peaceful manner to give the Indians and the Native Americans of the Spokane region some of their rightful land and some of their rightful place in the area. And so a local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution purchased a granite monument to replace the cross that was over his gravesite to kind of tell some of his story and to better commemorate him and show a marker of his resting place. Additionally, in Spokane, there's a really very meditative and contemplative park dedicated to Chief Gary. It's located not too far from Spokane Community College and Feltsfield area along the Spokane River. It's a place where he used to reportedly run his horses when he lived in that area. And it's called the Gathering Place, and it is a park dedicated to Chief Gary. And there's some basalt stones that kind of Spokane's very noted for, these column stones that kind of tell some of his story, and acts as a good place for us to reflect on the telling of that tale and to think about the lands for which we occupy when we're in Spokane. So that's that. And also how I came to know of Gary growing up was I went to Gary Middle School. Gary Middle School is the middle school that's in Hilliard. And every day I would go to middle school class, and you enter into the building, and in the entryway, they had all these artifacts and information. And they even had a mannequin that was kind of dressed like Gary, so you could kind of see what he might have looked like and what he kind of wore, and information about his life. And that's kind of how I was introduced and knew about Chief Gary growing up as a kid, was going to the school that was dedicated to him. So that is Chief Gary's story. And from there, we're going to segue on to, oh, there's one more slide that I just think is a cool slide. This is a very famous kind of postcard that circulates around Spokane. It depicts Spokane Falls in 1888 with a person fishing there, and Gary loved to fish. So every time I look at this, I always think it must be Chief Gary there fishing there in Spokane Falls. And I don't know if it's supposed to be or not, but I just thought it was a cool postcard to reflect on and think about. So from there, we're going to talk about James Jerome Hill, James J. Hill, who was the empire builder of Hilliard and of some of the railway developments that were through Spokane and in Spokane. But I'm going to back up the story slightly and talk a little bit about how James Hill ended up in the Spokane area to grow his kind of railway mogul stuff. James Hill had a railway backer, but before they were able to embark on building railways in Spokane, they were kind of preempted by John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, of course, everybody knows, is a big time developer in all of the United States, and he got the jump on building a rail line through downtown Spokane. In June 25th of 1888, you see this depiction of the first railroad engine coming through downtown Spokane. And it was constructed by the Western Central and Union Pacific Railroad. And that was the railroad line that John D. Rockefeller was financing and behind. And the big thing about that was the whole business of railway was to get all these commodities that were already discovered and junctioning within Spokane intercontinentally connected to the whole of the nation. The race was on to develop railway lines that were efficient, that were economical, that could get over all the different passes as cheaply as possible and as quickly as possible. And John D. Rockefeller had gotten the jump, and his competition was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was financing a different railway line, and that one was the Great Northern Railroad. And the executive of the Great Northern Railroad was James J. Hill. So J.P. Morgan put James Hill to task to come to Spokane and find a way to monopolize a railway in the Spokane area that could be competitive against Rockefeller, because these two were at war with this endeavor. So he came west to go figure it out. Before we look at the plot of land that he decided to utilize to build his rail station, we're going to look at Union Pacific Station. So this is the one that Rockefeller had constructed, and the roadway that you see here at the time was called Trent Avenue. In modern day, it was renamed, and it is Spokane, it's the Falls Boulevard, Spokane Falls Boulevard. So when you go to Spokane and you're downtown and you see Spokane Falls Boulevard, you're going to see a park, and then the river. And as you can see here, in the beginning times, it was Trent Avenue, there's downtown, there's the station. And even in these early days of development and industrialization to Spokane, they're already just constructing all over top of the river, and you almost can't even tell that the river's there. And it was kind of a running, not so much joke, but kind of a joke that for a long time during the industrial period of the beginnings of Spokane, people didn't even realize there was a river there in downtown because it was so developed over. So you can kind of see the beginnings of that and that construction. So here comes James Hill. He needs to build a line that's competitive against the Rockefeller line that's coming through downtown, and he's making a junction, and they need to be competitive. So they decide that what they need is to build a railway yard. And how that's distinctively different is a railway yard is where you actually construct and build these humongous engines that need to be trekking over across the mountain ranges, where they need to be maintenance, where they need to be repaired and maintained. That's the kind of place that he wanted to build in the Spokane area, and not just be a junction place to move cargo around. So he started scouting around the area of Spokane to find the perfect place to build this this rail yard. And he decided on a place that was called, at the time, Horse Plains or Wild Horse Prairie, which is about 5 miles north of how the crow flies from downtown Spokane. But most importantly, it is just right outside the city boundaries. So it makes his rail yard not behooven of any laws, regulations, ordinances, taxation, anything for Spokane. He can go and do what he pleases in this area of relative proximity to Spokane, but not be behooven of anything in Spokane. And that was a very important point to him, to keep this whole investment lucrative and free to do what he pleases. He needed to keep that distinction, to have this area be separate from the rest of the town. So, and you see here one of the pictures, there's murals all over Hilliard area that kind of depict the railway and James Hill, and just kind of the lifestyle of people that lived back in the early 1900s, kind of all over Hilliard area, and actually all over Spokane in general. But they're still there, and they're really cool. This particular one actually has gotten the building it was on burned down, so it's not actually around anymore, but there's still several more. So we're gonna move on. So this is the rail station that James Hill constructed. And as you can see, a fairly decent community is sprouting up around it for the people that are going to be working this area, building this area. And of course, Hill was also very cunning and keen. He didn't necessarily want to buy up a lot of land, because that's a lot of land that they now have to maintain and take care of. Instead, he would invest in any business that wanted to be alongside the roadway, the railway, and be nearby and be dependent on the railroad. But he would kind of help support financially any businesses that wanted to be endeavored along it, to kind of save him some of the worry of maintaining that land, but also kind of buys him people who are going to be heavily invested in keeping that railway where it is, and following kind of his lead as far as how he wanted things to go. And at this point, this community of sorts doesn't really have an official name, even though it was kind of spoken around town, people referring it to Hill's Yard. He did not like his name in any way referred to or referenced as this place. He didn't want his name associated with that closely with the railway line. But such as it goes, because it didn't really have any other name other than the facility itself being called West Regional Terminal Facilities, which doesn't exactly fall off the tongue as a place somebody would live. That's what people came to call it and associate with, as being Hill's Yard. So that's where it kind of grew up out from. But he made it extremely clear to everyone who was in that community, even though that community was growing and growing all the time to serve as employees and businesses along the railway, that he did not want anybody to even speak about incorporation with Spokane, that he came out to this area specifically to not have to deal with any of the ordinances or taxes involved with being part of Spokane proper. Just the same, the people living there really had services and utilities and things that they needed, and kind of underneath, outside of his view, 89 gentlemen from the area pulled together a vote and voted with the tiniest margins, and they only needed a simple majority of 45 to 44 to agree to submit for incorporation that immediate area, and submitted their request to the state. Now, James Hill caught wind of it pretty quickly, and very swiftly and very sternly, he put out in the publications and the news wires that if they were to follow through with their intentions of incorporation in any way, he would completely pull his yard completely out of the area. He would take down every building. He would take down every piece of track. He would fold any business that was along the area and leave everyone destitute if they even considered following through with their threat, as he looked at it, with township and being incorporated with Spokane. So basically, they just kind of left it at that and figured that it didn't really follow through with, and they would just leave well enough alone because they didn't need their livelihoods sacrificed over the incorporation, even though they were basically at the whim of whatever James Hill was willing to do for the neighborhood to keep it upright and working. Just the same, the little Hilliard town of itself was growing exponentially. It was up to 350 men in the area at 1900. And the other influx of participation it was having was the downtown area of Spokane in the early 1900s. Number one, they had just suffered a fire just like Seattle and Ellensburg had, which burnt a lot of the original part of downtown Spokane to the ground. So they're reconstructing a lot of those buildings and facilities, and they've decided to kind of up their ante downtown. They wanted it to look more sophisticated and be more reflective of an upper class kind of aesthetic. And so they, in addition to building these buildings out of brick and masonry and being very fancy, they also laid down a lot of city ordinances through downtown Spokane to push away all the itinerant livelihood people and the red light district and the Chinatown and anything that was in downtown that they weren't so keen about. They wanted those influences to go away from downtown and be someplace else because they wanted to kind of raise the level of prestige of downtown for that area. So Hilliard was a very natural place to receive those people because James Hill frankly didn't really care. And there wasn't any city ordinances or laws or anything to keep people from doing what they want to do. It was very Wild West in that corner of the area. So a lot of those kinds of people came to the Hilliard area to settle, which really grew that area even more exponentially. But it kept reinvigorating the need that they needed something to serve as mechanism to provide them with services with police and with fire and with utilities, and they just weren't getting it from Mr. Hill. And Mr. Hill, if he had any pushback from the people that were living there, had no problem with just getting rid of the people who were causing him issue. And because he was the train mogul, he would just literally get a boxcar full of people to reemploy and do the work that he needed to get done. One particularly noteworthy example of this is in 1904, very similar to what you read about in Cold Millions. His machinists in Hilliard were starting to talk about having a strike and about how they wanted better working conditions and wanted better guarantees on their positions and working. And James Hill wasn't having it. He wasn't even going to entertain any of those kind of threats. So he just fired them all. And most of those individuals were immigrants of a Italian background. So he was quick to go get a boxcar full of Japanese workers who have a different culture and a different language and aren't going to be able to communicate well with the other lower classes within the area, and will literally house them in the box cars that he brings them over in, and can have total control over those people and retrain them to take over the jobs of the people that were giving him trouble. So it was a very controlled situation that he had a handle on, and it would kind of keep people under control. But one of the things it did provide for Hilliard in the early days is a real diverse community. So within pockets of Hilliard, these small little areas would develop that were very reflective of the cultures and of the peoples who were brought into the area to service. So there would be areas with produce stands and restaurants and other services that were very reflective of the cultures and languages of the people for which they came in. There was a little Italy area. There was an area that was established with the Japanese community. And those areas still are kind of reflective and echo today. So next slide. So, and a lot of those buildings and structures that were developed at that time are still standing, which is particularly interesting. And, but over time, and as things aged, this was early 1900s, they still coming back wanting a lot of push to be reincorporated as part of the Spokane Township. And James Hill is starting to get older. He's still the executive of Great Northern Railroad. And even after he passed, you know, the railroad is still a huge conglomerate. They still have power and control, but the people are starting to outgrow the area, and they are starting to gain in their more of their own power and push to get incorporation. So a records request was finally sent in 1905 to find out where they were at in their process for incorporation. And after a double check, a chairman of the committee found that technically on paper, they were already incorporated because of the vote that was achieved back in 1895. So all they had to do was just re-annex and redraw the lines and become part of Spokane, which did take several years of its own. There were a lot of roads that needed to get renamed. There were maps that were going to have to be redrawn. There was a lot of debate with the railroad company on whether or not they would be added into those boundary lines and be taxed. So a lot of negotiating had to be done ultimately to make all that come about. But eventually, by 1924, the city lines did incorporate the Hilliard area, and they were fully annexed and taxed appropriately so they could start receiving the services that they so desperately needed to have, you know, police and fire and utilities provided to that area through the way of Spokane. And now by that point, James Hill had already passed. So he wasn't in the way of doing that anymore, though I'm sure that there was still plenty said by the railway in and of itself as far as what they would be willing to participate with that. So that's where that ended up going. Get to my next slide here. But change was still really happening pretty dramatically with the railways. To stay competitive, to be able to move bigger and heavier loads of commodities up and down over the mountain ranges, and just to stay vital, and prosperous. They had to do a lot of conversions. They converted from coal-fired engines to oil-fired engines. They had to build bigger and bigger engines that could move longer sets of boxcars and whatnot over to keep moving all this churn of commodity around. And that got more and more expensive and difficult as time moved on. And during the 40s and the 50s, diesel engines were the main and only type of engine that they wanted on those lines, as steam power just weren't powerful enough to get over the passes with the type of demand in commodities that they were going to be hooked with to get over. And then as things continued on into the 60s and the 70s, they started having a whole new problem. The railway system, which up to this point really didn't have any competition other than itself, started finding that it was starting to compete with semi-trucks and freight airlines with providing travel service for commodities. And those systems of commodities movement could do things a lot more cheaply and a lot more fluidly than what could be achieved with the railways for a lot of different things. And they started to feel the pinch of that. So the rail lines were starting to get used less and less and less as time moved on. So the train conglomerates kind of merged and thinned. The rail lines were getting used less and less, but they were static to the ground, so they were still there whether they were being used or not, kind of making a mess and an eyesore. In the 70s, there was a movement in Spokane at one time to repurpose or reuse the rail lines that were through Hilliard. They had an idea that they could make it like a feature, like a tourist attraction, by reutilizing the lines to provide scenic transportation for passengers looking to take trips to Newport or Colville or Kettle Falls, and they could use it like an attraction. So they tried to make an arrangement with Burlington Northern Railroad that owned the lines at the time to see if they could make it kind of a turn of the century village with a railroad motif that could kind of sell this whole kind of park-like feel and really share the history and story of the rail lines. But Burlington Northern was actually not particularly receptive to the whole idea. They weren't really keen about putting coal burning train engines back on their lines because they weren't they were old and they were broken down and they were dangerous and there were issues with them ecologically, and they just didn't want the bother with that. So after several years of trying to get this idea off the ground to reuse the rail yard as a tourist attraction, they kind of ended up having to give up on it because they just couldn't make it be a vital self-sustaining program that could keep going. And so by 1970, all their efforts ceased. And actually before that, by 1982, all the Hilliard diesel shops closed. And so there was no more maintenance or care or development of train engines in the Hilliard area at all. It all just kind of stopped and just kind of sat there doing nothing for a while. Kind of a mess. So that's that. And like any person of any stature or history in Spokane, it's a very common thing. We have these little one block park developments sprinkled all over Spokane neighborhood communities. And James Hill is one of those who has a park established and named after him. He had his park established in 1924. It's on the corner of East Nebraska. That just kind of doesn't really tell any of his story, but it just kind of gives his name a call out to remember him by, that he was part of this community and part of its development and history to be told. So that's James J. Hill. Now we're going to move on to talking about Agnes. Now, as I mentioned before, earlier, that there was a period where the downtown Spokane area was very keen to kind of revitalize itself after its fire and kind of set up a lot of ordinance and things to push a lot of the itinerant housing and red light district and other things kind of away a little more from its downtown core because they wanted it to be more. They were developing the Davenport Hotel. They were making all these fancy theaters and different clubs and things that were going into the area. And they didn't want any of the lower class people kind of living around and hanging around the downtown area. So they kind of pushed off into Hilliard. And here we have Agnes, who lived in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, kind of came to live in Hilliard with her husband, and kind of got known as being the one woman social worker bureau of the area, and really was a champion of the working class and the lower class people, particularly the Hilliard area, but in Spokane in general as well. Her husband, Thomas, and her, they actually relocated into the area. They were originally from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he came kind of before his wife to establish a business. They opened initially, when they came into Hilliard area, they opened a saloon, which is quite common back in the day, quite a lucrative thing to do. They certainly had the demand for it in that area. It was a very thriving business in Hilliard. But unfortunately, his business was quite so thriving that masked robbers decided to storm his bar and shoot Thomas in the face so they could steal the till, which at the time had $185 in the till. And they made off with his till, but Thomas actually recovered and was able to testify against his attackers and send them to state penitentiary. And I'm not sure what $185 would be worth now compared to then, but they didn't get very far. They ended up in the jail either way. Agnes, in the meantime, was quite the socialite and quite philanthropic in her activities. She really enjoyed getting out there and doing good works and being involved in the community. So she involved herself quite early in the Social Services Bureau, belonging to Spokane Women's Club, being involved in Girl Scouts. She was on Washington State's Tuberculosis League. She was a member of the Catholic Daughters of America. She was very socially involved. And because of those activities and the diligence of her husband, they were a very well-liked community couple in Hilliard and very well respected. So Thomas himself, move on to my next slide, he decided after the saloon experience that and also because Prohibition was coming upon the scene, he thought it'd be a good idea maybe to switch businesses. So they sold their profits from their saloon endeavor and decided to open up a hardware store on the corner of Market and Olympia. And you can see that building still exists today. There's a modern picture at the bottom showing that it still stands with their name Kehoe over the marquee at the top. And they ran a very successful hardware store that also had some short-term housing above the store that they kept going for quite some time. As a matter of fact, their daughter, Ethel, continued running the store for quite many years long after their passing. And like I mentioned, the store continues on today and is being refurbished by a local couple who are intent on bringing some of the old restoration of the historical buildings in downtown Hilliard alive, and are intending to build an antique store into that building. So it still keeps going. Let me move on to my next. So like I mentioned, they had this very successful business. They were very community active. Thomas himself had become mayor, an early mayor of Hilliard in the beginnings of its incorporation. It was involved locally, politically, but a lot of people were really pressing for Agnes to become more politically active and were really nudging her to consider taking a seat on the Washington State of Representatives. Now, this appalled her husband at first. You know, it's not the normal thing for women to do. And he vowed that he would never vote for a woman for any kind of state representative seat, not even his wife. But at some point, he must have had a change of heart, because Agnes did end up running for state representative in the 3rd district of the Spokane County, and she won, and she continued to hold her seat for 4 terms. So she held her term from 1939 to 1947. And she campaigned on the slogan of that she would never get drunk and she would never sell her vote. She was squeaky clean as they could get. And that whole persona for especially the Hilliard area was a real breath of fresh air for the community. They really respected her and took her opinions very valuable. She was a strong supporter of public libraries and particularly for public health and welfare and for the working classes, which was also very popular amongst the people of Spokane in general and in Hilliard. She was heavily supported by both Republicans and Democrats alike, which also made her very successful in her political career. Now, in 1951, Agnes earned the Marion Award from Holy Names College due to her significant contributions made to the community. During her 4 terms of service on Washington State Representatives, she sat on committees for public buildings and grounds, education, liquor control, unemployment relief, public welfare, state library, appropriations, food and drug, medicine and dentistry, and public utilities. She sponsored several bills, including to support public library and public health and welfare. And that was the legacy of her life. Thomas himself passed away in 1946. Agnes followed a little over 10 years later in 1959, but Hilliard strongly remembers them and the legacy that they held for being the champions of the working class, them both as a couple and particularly for Agnes as well. So much so that the local housing authority in Spokane, when they had opportunity to acquire the old Hilliard High School building and refurbish it into low-income housing, they dedicated the building to Agnes Kehoe. And this building provides 50 units of low-income housing for the community. 20 of those units are dedicated specifically for disabled veterans. There's been a lot of talk over the years that they think the building is haunted because of all the different uses and stuff that it's had over the years, but there's been recent reports by the residents of that building that there's no such issue, that it's a perfectly lovely and welcoming and warm place to live. And of course, the building with its historical background as being a high school in the early days of Hilliard and moving forward with its reinvigoration, it's on the National Archive of Historic Buildings. So that is Agnes. And now we are going to move on to, oh, and of course, like everybody else, Kehoe gets her park because everybody gets a park in Spokane. They've got a 1-block park. It sits on the corner of Nelson and East Wabash, which just kind of kills me because that's like 4 or 5 blocks down from where I lived in Spokane, but it was dedicated in her honor in 1992. And I think that was literally the year that I moved out of Spokane, which is kind of funny, but I did go back to see it later. This is my picture of her park dedicated to Agnes Kehoe. We're going to talk about Expo 74. So as I said earlier in this program, that especially during the 60s and 70s, the railroad industry was really taking a downward turn because they had all this heavy competition from trucking and freight lines. It just was not the booming industry like it was in its early conceptions when Spokane was built. So all these heavy rail lines through downtown Spokane were just this big burdensome eyesore that there was no easy way to get around. And here's kind of a picture of its kind of later days of development, all the different overpasses and structures going over viaducts and everything going over the river made trying to get around here and trying to redevelop downtown to be something other than this industrial park made it incredibly difficult. And so the local businessmen who were in that area at that time were very keen to find a way to revitalize the downtown core of Spokane and redevelop the land, particularly taking advantage of what is arguably their best asset, which is the Spokane River and the falls, which you could even see amongst all of this industry that was planted kind of on top of it. So in 1959, an organization of different business owners, particularly Washington Water Power and Coles Publishing, who produces Spokesman Review, formed an association called Spokane Unlimited. And they were looking to create a revitalization concept, a renewal plan that would be appealing to the city of Spokane to consider bonding by the way of gas taxes, a new look and a new purpose and a new direction for downtown Spokane, to really beautify the area and to make it more appealing. Unfortunately, because 60s and during that period, gas was a bit of a shortage and people were not interested in being taxed in any way. Two of the bond measures that they tried to submit to the public to get this whole plan up and off the ground in 1962 and 63 were completely shot down. Now, people wouldn't even consider, and for a couple of different reasons, because taxes were not particularly popular, but also there was a mindset that that tax money was really just going to benefit the downtown business owners who were already amazingly rich as it was, and they didn't see the point in giving them tax money to improve their businesses. They didn't see themselves as getting anything to gain out of having this. There was a lot of urban sprawl in the area, and the people were perfectly happy living in their suburbs far away from downtown. They didn't really care what was going on downtown. So they hired a urban renewal development planner with a lot of experience. His name was King Cole, who kind of looked at this whole issue to see if there was ways that he could help convince the public that it would be beneficial to everyone to see a revitalization to the downtown core. And one of the things he did was not just partner with Spokane Unlimited and the business owners, but to formulate a grassroots effort of just general regular Joe people who could really see the value in updating the downtown core. So they worked to went with a local New York conceptual drawing company, and they put together this plan to kind of showcase to the people what downtown could potentially look like, what benefits it could bring to all the people of Spokane, to kind of drum up support. Another thing that was kind of on the horizon that they felt was encouraging that they could use it to really kind of sell the whole revitalization concept was that Spokane was established in 1873. So they were coming up on their first centennial birthday, and they thought maybe they could piggyback that kind of centennial attitude with a revitalization project and get people on board with doing something and getting the tax money that it would take to make these kind of necessary improvements and really turn downtown into something they could be proud of and really make a lot of money with. Unfortunately, when they brought these plans and ideas, which weren't bad plans or ideas, to their advisors, the advisors looked at the overall scope and how much it was going to cost them primarily, and how many resources it would take to make this idea a reality. They said they can't achieve what they're looking for by just asking their local taxpayers. Matter of fact, they're not going to get what they're looking for just by asking their state, or not even their government, because there's not even enough federal money to do what they're doing. They needed to think bigger than that. They had to go global. And that's what they recommended for Spokane Unlimited to do, was to go really big. And that meant to go, let's go host a World's Fair. You want to clean up downtown, you're going to need to go way bigger, go home, because it's going to take resources that are beyond your scope. So they tried it. And what was kind of something that they kind of used to kind of help sell the concept, because they got to take this idea to the World Fair Organization to kind of pitch their idea, because at that point they would have been the smallest township to have ever host a World Fair ever. But the theme, which had already been picked out for that World's Fair for 1974, was already determined to be environment. And they thought, aha, so we're revitalizing a river. We're going to revitalize this beautiful falls. We're going to turn this big mess of a train track station into this beautiful park space that everyone can enjoy. What better plan to put together to present to the World Fair Organization and see if they can give the okie dokie for them to host this amazing party and help them pay for the revitalization for it. So they got the EPA on board. They got the Bureau of International Expositions of Paris to back them. They got the state to back them. They got the government to back them. They were, the Washington State Legislature had already developed an Expo Corporation and Commissions group that passed monetary bills and startup pledges to the tune of $11.9 million. This is back in the 70s, $11.9 million. But they had one more hurdle they still had to jump over, and that was, despite everything that they were doing, they still had to get the locals to approve the plan. They had to get a little more money from locally to push this plan through. So the city authorized a $5.7 million bond issue to remove the tracks, the trestles, and to clear what is called Halverman Island. Halverman Island, if you know anything about the Spokane River as it goes through downtown Spokane, it kind of splinters off and then comes back into itself, and there's this little spit of land in the middle. That's Halverman Island. And so they needed to clean all that stuff up, and they left that as the responsibility of the city. And they already know, they tried twice before to get the taxpayers to flip the bill with a gas tax bill, and they knew they weren't going to have any more luck doing it this time than they did before. And so our advisor said, you got one more shot, and that's to go back to the business owners who are pushing this concept to begin with, and you get the money from them by way of a B&O tax, which was incredibly unpopular with the business owners. But since they were the ones that were starting this whole party of wanting to revitalize downtown, they were going to have to be the ones to flip the bill. So that's what they ended up doing. Otherwise, this whole concept would have went out with the bathwater. So we are on with finally removing the tracks, removing the station, cleaning up downtown, except for, like everything else in Spokane, there's opposition, because there's opposition with every single move we make in Spokane. The opposition here was there were people who actually genuinely liked trains and liked the station, because they knew that conceptually Expo was going to need civic space. It was going to need pavilions and other center spaces for which to run the fair. Why couldn't we use the station as one of those structures for which that they can build into the whole conceptual drawing of the park? So they really wanted them to save that station and have that be part. Unfortunately, I don't have any cool pictures of what the station looked like from the inside. I couldn't find any, but I did do some readings, and apparently there was beautiful marble floors and all this cool stuff on the inside. No idea what it actually looks like. But at that point, the business owners downtown, having pushed to get all this junk removed and be done with it, after having to pay for it and flip the bill in the end, they were over it. They were done with the station. So their answer back to this small group of people who were really pushing together this agenda of, hey, environmentalism is also about preservation, and shouldn't we preserve this wonderful building as part of the concept? They did get, the clock tower was already part of the conceptual drawing, because the makers of Expo could see the clock tower being a cool element to the whole overall concept of Expo 74, but the station was gone. If they wanted to keep the station, they had to drum up another $1.5 million. And as we already scoured every corner and nook and cranny for any extra funds, there was no extra $1.5 million that anybody had to keep that station. So the station was gone. It was out of here. So they got rid of that. Even tried putting it past through the voters, and it lost pretty heavily with a 3.1 margin in 1972. And the city parks department was quick to break that thing down. So it was gone. So that's that. So we're on with Expo, and I'm going to talk a moment about this wonderful theme of environment and how it was kind of utilized during as a theme of the park. So environmentalism generally as a movement in the 70s was really just kind of starting to understand itself. It was still trying to figure out what its relationship would be with America's democratic and kind of capitalistic ideology. How do you be environmentalism and all of this going on at the same time? And because the powers that be that were developing this whole revitalization program and the powers that were putting together Expo itself tended to be a little more conservative in nature, the interpretation of the literal word environment got a very broad usage. So they didn't want Expo 74 with his environment theme to get too preachy or schooly or teachy. They wanted a Disney party atmosphere. They wanted a fun place for people to go. They didn't want their finger wagged about anything like that. They wanted to have a really fun environment. Some of the sponsors and other country representation that came into Expo to participate in the events were also kind of a little critical or kind of a little different in their interpretation of environmentalism. Russia in particular put together kind of depicted this tree-like forest metal structure that nobody could really quite figure out what the heck was going on. But they had a spokesman that came out and said during the event that the surest way to safeguard the biosphere lies not in the passive protection, but in the intelligent and scientific substantiated use of natural resources. So kind of figure that one out from a Russian perspective. Then we had Nixon himself, who paid a visit to Expo 74. He was in the midst of a Watergate scandal, and he was selling environment as a new environment of nations, and that we're developing a new environment of high employment and ample energy, again, being on the back of the energy crisis. So he's trying to kind of broaden the definition of environment to mean a lot of different things. The energy pavilion that was put into play in Expo 74 represented every fossil fuel and nuclear power company that was around. The agriculture pavilion that was put in Expo 74 had every agribusiness, chemical, petroleum, food processing firm, sponsor that you could think of. Ford Motor Company made a big splash during Expo 74 because they used the opportunity to showcase their new ATV vehicles that you can explore environment while you tear it all up. So it was kind of interesting. And even Ford, as president at the time, came out and made a comment that America truly is interested in cleaning its environment, but not at the exclusion of their job or adequate supply of gasoline. So that was kind of the reinterpretation, of you will, or interpretation of environment at the time, at the 70s. There were people that came out and gave talks on recycling. Recycling was a really big thing, and keeping things clean. So it was lauded as the tidiest expo of them all because it was very cognizant about having trash receptacles everywhere. See here a picture of the garbage goat was a very popular thing, and it still is to this day, about keeping the area clean and tidy. But the imagining of the word environment had a broad interpretation, and of course, more opposition. So the people who were against the whole idea of Expo 74 came back out. We had a group called the Yippies, Youth International Party, who would organize marijuana smoke-ins and organize protests in the park, chanting Exploit 74, because they recognized that having this event, bringing in literally millions of people worldwide into one tiny little town, would probably have some environmental impact. And shouldn't we think about those kinds of issues? So they kind of labeled it environmental world farce and kind of gave a lot of chants and were very critical of the whole experience. So I imagine the scene at Expo 74 is being quite interesting and surreal, with a lot of dichotomy going on amongst the different people that attended, with different kind of agendas and viewpoints about how we were interpreting our environment at that time. So it must have been quite the scene. I get corrected by my parents all the time that I keep saying like I wasn't present. Technically I was, but I was 3. So I have zero memory of Expo 74, but my parents like to remind me that technically I was there. So there we go. So we're moving on to the next slide. So now, once Expo was complete, because it runs for about a year, there was a new dedication of the park space. So it transitioned from being the site of Expo 74 to ultimately becoming Riverfront Park. And Jimmy Carter, who was the president at that time, actually came and rededicated the park. And it was successful in its ultimate endeavors of taking out all of the train and all of the station and all of the development that was originally put into downtown Spokane, that grew it into this amazing town that it is in size and its prominence. Now we're having to change its vision completely and turn it into something new and different. And Riverfront Park definitely provides that kind of place. Now, when you go to Spokane, it's one of the highlights and gems of the city, where they have amazing events and activities that people can come to and enjoy as a tourist place. And it has provided a lot of revitalization to the downtown core, even though urban spread through Spokane is still very much a thing that's alive and well. People do note it for its downtown activities and stuff. And not all preservation got lost. There was one more item that was preserved and saved for Riverfront Park, although it was not used for Expo, and that is one of my favorite things at Riverfront Park, which is the Olaf Carousel. The Olaf Carousel was originally part of another park. It was part of Natatorium Park that was quite a ways downriver and on west side of Spokane. And you kind of think of Natatorium Park, it started in the very early 1900s. It's kind of like a river version of Birch Bay. It was a little carnival. It was a place where people could go camping and picnicking. I think it had different concepts over the years to kind of keep it alive and well. I think at one time they had zoo animals there and lots of different things. But in 1909, the Vogel family, who established the park, obtained a carousel as a gift for their daughter for her birthday. And they had that carousel at Natatorium Park up until 1967, when unfortunately Natatorium Park just lost in vitality and had to be closed. So from 1967 until 1975, the Olaf Carousel was in storage. They brought it back out to be reincorporated into Riverfront Park. And it actually originally was rehomed in the Bavarian Beer Garden Pavilion that was in Expo at the time. But they didn't bring it out during Expo because they were a little bit afraid that the huge influx of people would be a little bit too deteriorating to the Olaf. So they waited to bring it into the park until after. And it's been enjoyed for decades of people who have lived in the Spokane area. Recently, Riverfront Park has been revitalized again, and it's been restructured. One of the things that I appreciate about its new vision is that some of the elements in the new park redesign incorporate what the lands and vegetation would have looked like prior to any and all development of the area, which is something the area hasn't seen in over 100 years. So you can walk through the park now and see little garden areas showcasing what this land would have looked like before we came upon it at all, which is kind of a very heartwarming thing to see that revitalization kind of happening within the park. But there are other elements that got revitalized, some pieces of Expo they've tried to reimagine and redo, and bring in other art elements that resonate with the people of Spokane. So that's kind of my story and my history. Let me see if I haven't had a chance. I've been talking like a maniac for over an hour and I've kept you over, and I'm so sorry. I try to keep us tight and I just can't do it. But that is the story of Spokane.